Hey everyone, my name is Rooster, and welcome back to Mechabellum, and welcome to the second episode in Community Plays, where I'll be featuring 3 different replays, trying to kind of go over some core concepts of what makes a successful board. Starting with this replay sent in by Dusza versus Cads, which is happening at around 400 MMR. The other 2 replays are going to be around 900 and then 1500-ish MMR. So this really covers a broad range of gameplay, and whilst some games will, feature different types of mistakes to different degrees, I think there is, a red line that passes through all of these, and I'm going to try and kind of explain them. I won't be covering the entire game here. I think we will let at least play the very beginning, but then as we go over the other games, I'm just kind of going to try and show you guys how the board developed, the main, perhaps, issues, as well as good things that occurred, and how to fix them and why they mattered. So, first game here, Dusza versus Cads, and we have a Rhino Specialist versus a Quick Supply Specialist, with both players starting with Chaff Clear and Chaff. We have Badger's Fang for Cads, we have Spider Crawler for Dusza. Now, in these type of scenarios, the easy thing to try and improve your boards is always going to be, what was I given and what am I lacking out of, in the early game, the 3 core roles of Chaff Clear, Chaff, and DPS. So Chaff here is available, Chaff Clear is available, we are lacking DPS. So something like a Marksman would be perfectly fine. Same thing for Dusza. We started with Chaff in form of Crawlers, we have Spiders for Chaff Clear, so we lack DPS. So we would be looking for something like Marksman. Void Eye, also an acceptable pick. Now, another thing that you could do, if you want to go for something a bit more expensive, like a Phoenix, is build more Chaff, right? Chaff is really important, and you're going to keep seeing this throughout these games, to defend your carries, right? Defend your main DPS, defend your Chaff Clear so they can do their job. And already here on round 1, you can see how that matters. Right side Spider is well defended. Bunch of Crawlers surrounding it, trickling around, making sure that it doesn't get instantly locked onto. Left side, however, Spider was left alone. Crawlers arrived too late, and the Spider will go down very, very rapidly without being able to do much of its job. It's still going to be able to take out 2 Badgers, but on the right side, you can see that this guy is doing a lot more because we defended it adequately. It will still end up going down because we're kind of lacking, the DPS or the extra Chaff that should have been purchased. In this scenario, right, buying Hounds has an overlapping role with the Tarantulas, and therefore this first round doesn't go that well. But this is where, right, already we are showcasing the power of using Chaff to protect our important units and making sure that we have our core roles covered. Round number 2, unit reinforcements show up. So again, right, when these show up, if you don't know what to pick, try and ask yourself, what are these units doing? What are their main roles? And so we have Arclight, which is a Chaff Clear unit, Mustang, which is a Chaff Clear unit, that also kind of functions as anti-air. It's a bit of a jack of all trades. Stormcaller, which is a DPS unit, and Steelball, which is a DPS unit and tank. So in this type of scenario, for Dusza, we would be looking for DPS or anti-air. Both here are missing. So Mustang would be acceptable. Stormcaller would be great as well. For Cads, it's similar in nature. You can go for the jack of all trades, the Mustang. You can go for Stormcaller as well. In these type of games, if there's little Chaff or a ton of Fangs and slow units like Tarantula, Badger, something like a Sabertooth, going for Stormcaller is always going to be a safe pick. It's a great unit in long-range fights. Cads here is going to be picking up the Mustang. Now, Dusza picks up the Arclight. Granted, it's very powerful, but it has, again, role overlap with 2 of the other units that we already have, which are going to be the Tarantula and the Hound. So it's a little bit awkward, right? It does have a lot of power, but it makes it a bit more tricky to then invest later on into some techs, which generally benefit from having more of the same unit. Because one of the things I want to go over, aside from protecting your units adequately, is range. Range is one of the best techs in the game for your carries, your DPS and your Chaff Clear. And almost in all games, it is going to be best to go for early range on your main Chaff Clear units. Now, If your opponent isn't buying any chaff and they're only buying tanks and mid-sized units, so they're just spamming steel balls, yes, you should go for a DPS unit and go range on that first. But if there's a bunch of chaff, like all of these crawlers, range on your chaff gear units is going to be the best thing for you. And then after that, you can try and build more DPS and more chaff. Now here, more chaff is being picked up. For dusza, I like that a lot. So they realized that, hey, that spider was dying a bit too quickly. Let me add some crawlers to protect it. Which is going to work somewhat. One of the marksmen still locks on. The crawler should have been a bit closer so they could actually overtake the tarantula. But the idea here is correct. And whilst there is, DPS lacking, the Arclight will provide some, and tarantulas are 200 costs, so they can kind of fight back themselves. They're not the worst into these type of boards with, Badger and a bunch of small units like Fangs, Mustang, Marksman. Arclight here will do its very best. We'll end up losing. I'm going to skip forward a little bit here as we enter round number 3. And now we have a selection of cards to make. We have Assault Scorpion, we have Nano Repair Kit, Shield Airdrop. Shield Airdrop is a fantastic spell to pick, especially if it shows up early. You just get it multiple times during the game. It generates great value. Nano Repair Kit if you're trying to play something big, and Assault Scorpion could be okay. Now, what you see here, right, is that the Badgers are rather exposed. Because Cads started with Fangs and put them behind, the Badgers are very much in the open. The Fangs are slower, so they will never overtake, and there are no crawlers here. That means that these Badgers are in trouble. And I think that dusza realizes that, goes for the Assault Scorpion card and says, well, that unit is very good against things like Badgers and Sledgehammers, so let me grab that. Which is a fantastic move. It also immediately solves the DPS problem that, was present. It doesn't solve the anti-air problem, which we'll get to later, but it does solve at least the DPS problem. And Kaz here does go for range on the Badgers on round 3, which I really like. However, there is then an overcommitment into this by also clicking Scorching Fire, which can be good down the line, but this early on in the game, it's going to make your board appear really empty. And you will see that there's kind of, one of the cardinal sins of Mechabellum, which is not using your deployments. 2 deployments are available. None of them are being used this early on in the game. Later on, yes, sometimes you can break that rule. But generally speaking, do not skip deployments because you cannot recover them. You're not suddenly going to get those 2 deployments next round. You can only get 2 every single round. 3 if you, grab it from the left tower with the mass recruitment. But it's going to be hard to recover the board state here if you're going to be skipping. So generally speaking, right, don't commit this hard early on. Because now your opponents can see, well, Cads really wants to go into Badgers because he already double-teched. So I can just keep going for more Scorpions, especially with the board being this empty. That is an important thing to showcase. Now still, Cads will win the round. And why will he win the round? Because he has a range advantage, which will work out in his favor as the Scorpions have the Assault variant, which decreases their range, and they don't have the tech, and Cads does. So that is why it's losing here. But board-wise, dusza is in a much, much better spot here. He gets his Rhino, and he decides to use it aggressively, which I very much like. I think that's a great play to make. When you get your Rhino, try and be a bit of a, a pest to your opponent. Try and go for some tower attacks, and then you can always sell it if it gets countered. Cads here going to go for a hyper carry Fire Badger, right? Clicking every single tech on the bar, going for Ignite, which can take down large targets. So you are essentially saying, well, my Badger can now, in theory, kill everything, which is true, but it's also very, very vulnerable, right? If it dies, you were relying on that unit to do everything. And currently it's not well defended because, again, right, you have to spend so much money to get all of these early techs that you don't have the money to go for deployments. Now, ideally, there should have been more chaff here, right? These Fangs should have probably been in front of the Fire Badgers so that they could immediately protect them. Some Crawlers perhaps should have been behind the tower to make sure that, just like over here, you can defend these units and they can actually survive for a bit longer. Javelin here gets picked up for dusza. Great spell on round 4. One of the best things in the game, honestly. Very cheap, quick cooldown. When it shows up this early, it's often a must pick because you will likely see it back and it offers great value. Kans also picked up a barrier. Doesn't have any giants yet, but when you pick this, ideally you do grab one relatively soon. And yeah, we have a Rhino here into the tower. Now, Ignite got picked up on the same round, so that's a bit of a shame perhaps, as one Badger does remain alive. And with the bonus range, they will be able to take down the Rhino. And on the other side, one of the main things, right, that is not really working is we still don't have range. And especially when you pick something like Assault Scorpion, which suffers from its lack of range, you should try and grab that tech. You can also go for something like Siege Mode, which is a really fun tech to click with this specific card, but I think in this scenario, range would work just fine. Still, with the help of the Javelin and the Rhino, it is a successful round for dusza, and now we enter round number 5. And on round number 5, we get spells, another barrier, super heavy armor. dusza here decides to go for the super heavy armor, which is a little bit of a mistake because the opponent already clicked Ignite, and getting more hit points into Ignite doesn't do anything, right? Ignite will tick at maximum hit point percentage, so whether the Rhino has 100k or 20k hit points, it will die at the exact same rate, at least to the Ignite effect. So you could click Photon Coating to block Ignite here, but honestly, if you see your opponent commit this early into the tech, it's better to just, you know, not even bother, get rid of it, grab a range on your main DPS unit now, because your opponent isn't buying any chaff, so buy range on your Scorpions, and, you know, watch them kill the opponent. There's a bit of a mistake here, as Acid Attack is picked up. Now, Acid Attack is great if you're dealing with very tanky units, like Fortresses, you know, stuff that has 40,000 or even more hit points. But if you're dealing with Badgers, which only have 5,000 hit points a pop, and your Scorpion is hitting for 10,000, it's already going to be one-shotting it. So what you want is for your units to connect. And how are you going to make it connect? By picking up range. So that is kind of here what's going to be the whole trend of this game. Opponent now quad text Fire Badger. I respect it. They had a plan in mind. They went for it. Again, one deployment here being skipped. You can see that the boards look very different in terms of how filled out they are. Very full board for dusza. Has been using all of their deployments. Has been buying, you know, in general, the correct units. Decides to go for Hounds with Incendiary Bomb as their chaff clear. I would have probably just, you know, never built the Hounds. Got some Marksmen, so there were no anti-air issues. And then range the Tarantulas. But, yeah. Overall here, board looking a lot better in terms of deployments. And over here, board is looking a lot better in terms of techs. Although we are, you know, kind of over-investing a little bit too much. Nuke being picked up early. I wouldn't shield for it. dusza at 2.6k hit points. You should not be dying here, even if it gets used, and by not building shields, you will at least have a bit of an economic advantage moving forward, and you should be able to prove that advantage. So, again here, Badgers will win. Scorpions with Acid don't have more range, and so they get caught off guard, and also that nuke did have a massive impact. So dusza now falling to 1600, losing 1000 hit points, and here you really need to start worrying a little bit about that range. And now, with the unit reinforcements, you also get reminded of the fact that, hey, air units exist, and I didn't buy any anti-air, so I need to be a bit worried about that. Once again, you have to look at your board, say, what am I missing? And, well, I am missing mostly anti-air. So what is the best option to pick here? Well, what are the matchups between these units, right? Overlord here, Raiden and Phantom Ray are all great air DPS units, but Overlord beats the other two. It's good into Raiden, and it's good into Phantom Ray. So ideally here, Overlord would get picked up, and that is the case for both players. Kans decides to go for Phantom Ray, which is, you know, a strong unit in itself, but in the presence of both of these units, which both counter the 200 cost flying unit, you should probably go for the Overlord. Now, keep in mind, Kans has Marksman, so it's not as much of you know, a mandatory thing to go for, but I still think Overlord here would pair very nicely. It's also a classic combination with the badgers, so it would have fitted the board nicely. Dusza also decides to go for the Phantom Ray. Once again, in this case, Overlord would have been a bit more solid. The Rhino is being kept. If we're keeping the Rhino, and I guess we are because we invested into super heavy armor, we really should click Photon, right? We got to realize that, hey, the Ignite is the thing that is killing the Rhino. If you manage to turn that off, the Badgers deal no damage, and that Rhino would just get in. Again, here as well, right? The range not being on the bar is what's creating problems. And, well, what we will see is that Rhino goes down very quickly, despite having 100k hit points. And it makes it very difficult for these Scorpions to get in. Because if they manage to hit, they will just one-shot an entire pack of units. I mean, you know, there we go. The level 2 Badgers, not quite, but with the acid ticking in this scenario, it does get the job done very rapidly, but it just takes a little bit too long to get there. And so here, it will just be another round loss for Dusza. I'm going to move things along a little bit more, where at some point we have Overlords being repurchased for Dusza as they realize, oh, maybe I'm struggling a little bit with the anti-air, but all along, the real problem here is going to be the range. More units get added. I'm not going to go over all of the rounds, but it ends up in a bit of a loss. And, you know, what would have been great here, I'm going to go back to round 5 and kind of showcase you guys, right, how much of a difference it really makes. I'm even going to do it on the nuke round, which we did end up losing, keep in mind. But if we just go for some range on our Scorpions, we give them some love, we'd be completely fine. I'm not going to go for the super heavy armor here, right? I'm seeing that the opponent has mass tech the Fire Badgers. We have Scorpions on the board. It is one of the best counters in the unit. So I'm just going to say, well, all right, you want to, you know, deal with my Rhino. I'm going to sell it, recover the money, go for range. My Scorpions, I'm also going to go for range here on my Tarantulas, and then I'm going to be playing Scorpion and Tarantula. We do lack some anti-air here, but I think it's fine not to really worry about that too much. Let's put some Scorpions on the board to try and deal with these opponent's Fire Badgers, right? Try and put units kind of directly in front of where you want them to end up, or like what unit you want them to kill, and then try and pair them up, right, with a chaff clear unit and with some chaff to be able to protect it. We have some money left here, so let's just grab that, go for another Tarantula on the right, so that this guy has his chaff clear, chaff, this guy has his chaff clear, chaff, and, you know, same thing all around the board. We can unlock something. We are going to get nuked here, which, you know, is a bit of a surprise. But hey, the opponent is loaning and they bought a very expensive spell. We're at no risk of immediately dying because we had 2.6k hit points remaining. And already you can see here that the Scorpion manages to get a shot off before it dies to the spell. So the right side, despite getting nuked, basically won. And the middle and the left side are completely fine here, as the late Crawlers, which were a great addition to the board, right, are protecting adequately, and now the Scorpions actually can hit the targets they were meant to hit. And so suddenly, the round goes from being a loss to being a win when your opponent nuked their economy, right? They went for an early loan, which is going to cost them next round. They went for a very expensive spell, that nuke, which costs 400. You didn't pick anything. And look at how full the board is, right? So that is kind of going to be one of the big things here. I'm going to briefly go back to the replay because, well, for CADs, what would have been great here, and I'm going to kind of go back a little bit to maybe something like round 3, where range on the Fire Badgers were picked up. I like the range on the Fire Badgers, I really do. But I think what I would have done here, right, is not double tech the Fire Badgers, use your deployments. We're going to pick up this barrier. I'm happy with where it is, and we're just going to range our Fire Badgers. We're not going to do more than that, right? Instead, what we're going to do is maybe grab some Crawlers here and put them somewhere in the back to try and arrive and deal with, or at least protect our Fire Badgers. I think that would be a lot nicer. We can add another Fire Badger as well here in the middle. At some point, ideally, these fangs on round 1 would have been here, in my opinion, so that, you know, we don't have to add anything in front either, and we immediately have the protection that we want. But this would have been more so, you know, a round that I would have liked to see. Now the opponent goes for Scorpion. We're not overly invested into the fire badgers. We can probably keep them around and have them for chaff clear, but at least we can make sure that, you know, we have adequate distraction for them, so we can keep them alive longer. Of course, they're not going to have the DPS to kill the tarantulas by themselves, but they don't have to, right? We have the marksman to help out with that, and that is kind of what, yeah, you should be playing around. Don't try and make a unit do everything from the get-go. Try and make sure that, you know, the units do the jobs they were meant to do, because that will save you money, and you don't have a ton of that in the early game. So that is one game. Let's move on to the next, which is going to happen at about 900 MMR, and we're going to go over some of the same concepts. All right, here we are. Game between Atanvak and Barbarix. Big thanks to Atanvak for sending this in. Also, big thank you to Dusza for sending in the previous video to get us started. And this, again, is going to be around 900 MMR. And what it features is an aggressive player versus a defensive player. So we have Atanvak here defending, and Barbarix is going to opt to play extremely aggressively by putting his units on the line. Now, already here, right, if you see your opponent do this, yes, it can look a little bit daunting, but units on the line are extremely vulnerable. It's going to be hard for them to defend this, and whilst you should not be over investing into sentry missiles, because, you know, again, you will nuke your economy, if your opponent does stuff like this and you can get, you know, 300 or 300 about value for a missile by killing his units, it's going to be worth to try and go for that, right? Very clumped units here. This is screaming for something like a Scorpion or, you know, a missile, even a Stormcaller, although the opponent is very close, but something of the sort. I'm going to speed things up a little bit here as the opponent continues to play very aggressively. And already here, right, there are some issues. Now, the main thing is that Atanvak wanted to play a long-range game, and his opponent prevented that from being possible because they decided to play aggressively. That is how defensive games are born, right? One player wants to just play around the towers, and they're fine playing long range, but it's going to be up to your opponent whether or not you get to play a long range game, depending on where they position. Now, all of your chaff is going to be behind the towers, right? If you were expecting or you didn't know that your opponent was vying for something more aggressive. And that means that in this scenario, these units up front are very vulnerable. Kind of the same thing that we just saw with those fire badgers from one of the two players. And what you should do then is defend them, right? Try and make sure that you do not get immediately locked onto by these marksmen, because this board is not that strong. Again, a missile here would completely destroy these units. Don't be too afraid to use like one missile if it kills half the enemy board. That is just a completely fine thing to do. Make them do something about it, right? If they start adding something like a shield or a missile interception, you know, sure, don't use that anymore. But try and poke and prod a little bit. But the main thing here that we need to think about is defending our units. And if I'm going to go a bit further, we're getting close. You know, sledgehammers here were added, but they're not exactly far enough forward. Once again as well, right, we see techs on units that are not range. Once again, typically in the early game, the only thing that you're going to want to click is range on your most important units. Oftentimes, this will be your chaff clear unit, but sometimes it can be your DPS unit as well. But we do not want to be clicking techs here, especially if we only have 2 of a unit. That is just not worth it this early on, right? Try and flesh out your board. So if I'm going to go back to something like round number 3, where, you know, the sledgehammers were added and take over from Atanvak's position, what we would be looking for, I mean, we can take additional deployment slot here. We can go for something aggressive as well. Let's say that we go for something aggressive, right? Try and punish the opponent a little bit. Go for something like that. And then all we need to do is protect our units, right? We add some fangs here. Now, fangs in these type of scenarios are going to be usually a little bit better than something like crawler, because they hold their formation a bit better. They don't go running in. So, you know, your opponent's chaff clear has to move in closer to actually be able to hit them rather than the other way around. And because they keep their formation a bit better, it also tends to draw in the enemy units towards this spot here on the map, which is very useful. But mainly what this does is make sure that these marksmen do not insta-lock the spider, and the spider can do its job. I'm also going to put this missile here, and now I have 600 resources remaining to do whatever I want. I mean, I am in a really good spot here. I can go for another tarantula, I can click range, and we're chilling, right? We are in a really, really good spot. You could even sell the saber here if you really want to grab this level. You can go for attack enhancement 1, end the round, boom, right? Half of the enemy board destroyed. Opponent has to do something about this. You know, yes, you're spending 50 resources on something temporary, but your opponent is just going to massively lose the round if they do something like this. And you might say, oh, I never see this happen in my games, but it is something that is rather common, especially when you start playing the game where, you know, your opponent is leaving these type of plays available and it just doesn't get punished. And, well, you can see here, right, what the power is of using that missile. You set up your range on your chaff clear, and you deal massive damage, and you just set yourself up for success later on. But protecting these units is just so important. It's the same thing here for Barbarics as well, right? Not putting your important units this close to the line. If the Fire Badgers were just a little bit further back, right, towards the end of the Fangs, then the Fangs would be able to frontline for them, and this type of missile play would not be available. And it's something that you're going to see a lot of at the higher levels. It's something that we're going to see as well in that final game. But this is very important. Now, let's go back to that replay and kind of speed up the process here, because what ends up happening is, I mean, atanvak does win with this this sledgehammer play, but it's not as big of a win, right? And now range is not available, and crucially, no missiles, I believe, are being purchased every round. Now, the opponent here, Barbarics, goes for a very aggressive play, something that we know as gospel with the early wasp play, big plays on the flanks rather. And atanvak, kind of by, you know, sheer coincidence, happens to pick up improved Wraith and picks up some Wraith, which happens to be one of the best counters to this type of strategy. So that is very nice. And it's another chaff clear unit, and it's a unit that really loves range enhancement. Again, that is something that we're going to see, right? In this scenario, the tarantulas did not receive range, and instead we decide to go for something like the Wraith, which is going to be a very nice thing, considering the fact that the opponent went for wasps. Right now, we are struggling a little bit because the opponent went for the Scorching Fire, or Scorching Charge rather, tech on the Badgers, which is destroying all of our chaff. But the Wraith is at least going to do a decent job here of clearing all of the wasps. Marksman will take down the Wraith, and that will send us into round 5. Now, this is another thing that I've seen a lot, where people tend to struggle a bunch when, you know, players go very aggressive and especially flank heavily. Now, flanks, you will not see that much, at least not a heavy flanks like this at the higher levels, because flanks are very vulnerable, right? These missiles that I showed earlier, which, you know, on the front line can be intercepted, or you can put a shield, or, you know, a missile interceptor. That's not available on the flank. You can't put missile interceptors over there. You generally cannot shield if you don't have that spell, and it makes the flanks just very hard to defend. There is no synergy usually between your flank and your main army. So if it is properly defended, then yeah, the defender will be advantageous in those scenarios. Now, if you see this from your opponent, you just kind of got to have a look at what the tech bar is. We do not see AA, which means that Wraith is going to be absolutely fantastic into these wasps. And we see jump drive as well, which means that the wasps are likely to move. Still, we should play around the fact that this is targeting our tower, and we should try and defend against it. Now, I'm going to show you guys what the board looked like, right, and what atanvak decided to go for. And again, right, we see a non-prioritization of range. And that is just not really standard. Sure, there are some games, again, where you'll find exceptions to this, but he decides to go 8-gun plus field maintenance. Now, 8-gun and range would have been great, but 8-gun and field maintenance is very uncommon because it just does not allow the Wraith to do its job properly. Especially something like Wraith, which tries to find as many different targets as it has guns, relies a lot on having that bonus range because it can then see more. And so it can also find more of those targets, which is why it is so good at defending these flanks, because even if it gets stuck on this type of an aggressive play, right, with the Phantoms with armor in front, it would just be absolutely crushing the Wasps even behind because it can shoot up to 8 targets. So here, range really would have been nicer on the round prior. Now, because the opponent decided to move and, you know, all the units had to spawn in, it still ends up being winning, but you would rather want something like that range enhancement. Round number 6, we get unit reinforcements. And so, well, you were able to win here the previous round if you're atanvak because the opponent had to spawn in. The scary bit is kind of these Phantom Rays, right? They have armor enhancement, one of them has a level. Wraith is not really meant to kill that type of stuff. It's better against, you know, smaller units like those Wasps. So all we need to find is something to deal with the Phantom Rays. And it was offered in the unit drop in the form of the Overlord. Again, Overlord is great against these type of units, right? It's great into Raiden, but it's also great into things like Phantom Ray. So that would have been ideal. Instead, atanvak decides to go for Mustang AA, which is an alternative to deal with Wasps, but we already had the Wasps covered because that is what the Wraith is very good at. And AA Mustang will still get stuck on those Phantom Rays because of the armor enhancement tech. So we basically leave this Wraith to, well, on its own to deal with everything, which it is an improved Wraith and it has 8-gun, so it probably can get the job done still. But it would be a lot better here if we just played around the unit drop. So that is what I'm going to be kind of showcasing here. All right, so if we take over here, I would want the Overlord. I'm going to position it in such a way that it will target these Phantom Rays. And then all we need to do is make sure that we level up our Wraith. And I want to defend all of our units adequately, right? I want this Tarantula to be safe. I want these units on the left to be safe, and I want these units on the right also to have a good time and not immediately get locked onto by the Phantom Rays. So let's make sure that we do that. Again, as well here, right, opponent is heavily invested on the flank, whilst the Wasps can move, the Phantom Rays cannot. So let's just use a couple of missiles here to, yeah, really, really hurt the opponent. I am going to go double missile to really severely cripple these units. You can even splash both of the Phantom Rays here by kind of positioning in the middle. I'm going to do the same thing on the front line. And you're going to say, oh, that's a lot of resources to spend on these missiles. But if it destroys the enemy board, unless you deal, you know, 1,000, 2,000 damage, then it's going to be worth it. You would pick a spell for that cost as well if it allowed you to do that much damage consistently. So you really need to punish your opponent if they're doing these type of things. And especially when you're behind and trying to recover tempo, it's completely acceptable to pick up things like spells and use things like sentry missiles if it, you know, kind of alleviates the pressure on your board. Let's go for the double attack and defense enhancements, and we even have money left to spare for, you know, whatever we would want. I'm going to keep it in the bank. Why not? But it really showcases that these type of scenarios, you can have a lot of money left if you use it wisely. Now, the right side may still struggle a little bit here because it is rather overwhelming. But you can see that, I mean, actually, even with the regen here, you are just completely crushing. And, well, 8-gun is a fantastic tech. With the range enhancement, it likely would have gone a bit better because, again, the Wraith would have been able to see all the Wasps behind and start shooting at them from the get-go. But it is an absolutely crushing round in this scenario. And yeah, again, right, it's all about protecting your units adequately and also just trying to see, like, what is my opponent trying to play and what is the main problem that I have. In this case, you know, how do I deal with these Phantom Rays on the front? And also, how do I punish the fact that my opponent is just not respecting, you know, the fact that sentry missiles exist and that if you clump up your board like this, it becomes extremely vulnerable to anything that has a lot of splash as well, right? So Wraith is great here, but something like a Vulcan or a Scorpion would do fantastic as well. Eventually, I think atanvak does end up winning. by utilizing the Wraith very well. It is an absolutely fantastic unit to try and defend flanks with, and I think eventually it goes for the degen beam. But once again, I think this game really showcases the power of just making sure that your units don't get insta-locked. We saw it in that first game with the Badgers, although, you know, the range was not picked up, and so the Badgers ended up living for far too long. And here as well, right, the marksmen are not being punished, despite them being extremely vulnerable because they're not well protected. The spiders, the sledgehammers are just, you know, in the open. They get immediately locked onto. That means they can't do their job. And it's kind of the same thing here, right? The Phantom Rays immediately locking onto the Wraith. Eventually, it doesn't matter. And atanvak will end up winning. But, you know, you want to try and prevent this. Just put one unit in front. Try and make sure that this first salvo doesn't go straight into the Wraith. Make sure that you also pair up your Wraith, which is a chaff clear unit, DPS. And just keep creating these bundles, right? Chaff to protect your bundle of DPS and chaff clear. So that is the second game. Let's now move on to the third game, which is going to be at around 1500 MMR, where some of these concepts are still going to be popping up. All right, and here we are, game number 3, which happens at around 1500 MMR between LichestKing, who submitted the replay, and Jamster. And the main thing that LichestKing was worried about here is why in the early game they were struggling to, you know, get anything done. They decided to play aggressively here with a Tarantula Fang opener, which is a very sensible thing to do, and they are going to be adding Void Eyes. Jamster on the other side is a training specialist, LichestKing is a fortified specialist, and we have Badger Marksman here to defend. Likely we'll be adding some chaff to that to make sure that, again, right, the core units are well protected. And you're going to be seeing here as well with this aggressive positioning, right, what I was talking about in that previous game, where at least in this scenario, we are positioning in such a way that the Fangs are protecting our other units from getting insta-locked. Now, I will say that I think this is a little bit too compact of a position because clumpage can become a bit of a problem, especially if the opponent goes for something like, you know, Stormcaller or, you know, Scorpion, which with the massive splash could still end up hitting your main carries. But we are at least positioning the chaff in such a way that we allow the tarantulas to not immediately get locked onto and die. Now, I'm going to be moving forward a little bit here as we go on round 3. Oh, actually, I will quickly go back to round 2. What we see here is even at 1500 MMR, right, we don't buy the correct units on round 1, right? We go for double Hound here on the opposing side, starting with Fire Badger Marksman, whilst the thing that we need is chaff. Hounds have overlapping roles with Fire Badgers, so there's no need to have those right now. There's no reason to, especially into something like Fang. LichestKing has purchased Void Eyes, which is the correct thing to do here, either that or Marksman, whichever you prefer. And on round number 2, we get unit reinforcements. And once again, you have to ask yourself, what are we missing? For LichestKing, it is going to be anti-air, right? Void Eyes don't have the ability to shoot up like Marksman do. So in this case, Phoenix would be ideal. It's a very classic pairing as well with these type of boards. If you're playing aggressive, you know, either Hound Saber or Tarantula Void Eye, very often you will want a Phoenix in the early and mid game because it covers most of your anti-air sorrows. For the opponent here, anti-air is already covered because we have Marksman, so Phoenix isn't as mandatory. Arclight, not needed. We already have 2 chaff clear units. Rhino, potentially pickable, but it is really bad into Phoenix and Saber, so you could pick it and try to go for an aggressive play. But, you know, there's a wall and a Chungus there. So ideally, you pick up the Sabertooth because the Sabertooth at least counters the Tarantulas. That would be, right, what I would be recommending here and what both players should be thinking about. Aside from that, chaff here, very, very important. LichestKing has, you know, only 2 Fangs. One of them here is defending the tower, which is fine, but it means that the right side is not very well defended. And so that's often why you're going to see me recommend that you just buy more chaff, right? Especially in the early game when you have nothing to do and you're kind of waiting for these unit reinforcements to help you out. That's going to be the best thing. And LichestKing here decides to go for a Sabertooth and puts it all the way on that flank. Now, the problem with this is that, yes, the tower is open, but a Sabertooth is really slow. And you've put it relatively far away from the tower by not putting it on the line on the flank. And it has to spawn in as well, which is going to take a while, right? So it has to spawn in, then it has to move forward with only 8 meters a second. It's just going to take a long time to get that debuff. And because you're playing so aggressively, the round is likely going to be over before this matters. It would have been way better to just pick up the Phoenix, make sure that you don't lose the anti-air, pressure the tower even more from the front lines. And if you really want to go to this tower, just put the crawler there, right? It's less investment. And it's going to get to the tower much, much quicker with the exact same result of taking it down. Also, buying more Void Eyes here is fine if they had the air tech on the Void Eyes, right? Because if you don't have the aerial tech, then building this many Void Eyes is just going to struggle way too much against things like especially Raiden. And, well, I mean, I imagine that in this scenario, LichestKing wants to use the Void Eyes as DPS, and if they're DPS, well, you don't want them to be chaff. So you still would want to buy chaff as well. And if you have to buy chaff, and you don't have anti-air, you're starting to get into some trouble as to what units do you exactly buy. So here, this just doesn't play out that well. The round indeed is over by the time the Sabertooth gets to the tower. And that creates some problems. Round number 3, we get redeployments, which is rather nice to try and recover the Saber from the flank. If LichestKing wants to, he could also sell the Saber. I would be completely fine with that. Now we at least do buy some chaff. However, he decides to range his Void Eyes. Now, ranging the Void Eyes here is somewhat fine because the opponent doesn't have a ton of chaff. But I would probably have recommended him to go for something like range on the spiders instead. And it just comes back to, in general, especially once you get to the intermediary level and people will start to buy a bunch of chaff, it is going to be better for you to grab range on your chaff clear units, especially when playing this aggressively with spiders. They can be extremely vulnerable, and the range will just increase their survivability by a ton. And here you can also see that the anti-air, right, problem is being punished by the opponents. And rightfully so, right? Jamster realizes, hey, there is no good anti-air here. Those fangs are likely going to be dying. So this Phoenix should win the round by default. And that is a very good play to make when you're defending, right? Try and punish the aggressive player, you know, for perhaps lacking some things, whether that is protecting the towers adequately or not having anti-air. Now, the Void Eyes do really well in this scenario. But, yeah, not having anti-air is going to hurt. And it will result in a round loss, sadly. Even if, you know, normally speaking, LichestKing here should have the tempo advantage. Fire on the Hounds did get picked up, which can be a little bit annoying. I like running a Missile Interceptor on my Sabers because it's good enough to stop this specific tech from doing its thing. So that is, you know, a little bit of a tech tip there that I would have. But yeah, I think here in this scenario, range would have been fantastic on the spiders. And it actually is going to take a while before we get there. And as a result, I mean, this round actually goes relatively well. But if we move forward a little bit, it takes a while before range is picked up on the spiders. And also, it just takes a little bit of time before the board is properly fleshed out. I think by this point, you would want a lot more chaff. And ideally, you would have a lot more spiders. Because honestly, spiders beat this entire board. They will absolutely crush the Mustangs, crush the Crawlers, the Hounds. The Marksman, if they get locked onto, will get taken down as well. The low-level Fire Badger, same thing. You don't really need your Void Eyes in this case. So it's also why I would generally recommend not to like heavily invest in this unless you're running Aerial Void Eye and, you know, you want to use your Void Eyes as kind of substitute Phoenixes, in which case, you know, you don't need to go for those Phoenixes. But it's just much better to generally flesh out your chaff and your chaff clear and just grab a few DPS units that do the job. you know, aside from the scenarios where your opponent is just really investing a lot into tanks and you absolutely need to get more DPS, like perhaps in that Fire Badger game that I showed earlier. So that would have been a big thing here. So what has gone wrong here, I guess, is perhaps kind of order of teching units by first teching the DPS instead of teching the chaff clear. And, you know, going for aggressive plays that just take too long. We do defend the left side adequately by, you know, respecting spells like the Wasp drop and using it defensively ourselves. But again, here, right, opponent decides to go for Raiden. And the fact that we didn't pick up anti-air, which is a very common thing to do on round 2, and why that Phoenix should have been picked up, is being punished here. So good play from Jamster, right, realizing, hey, my opponent is just lacking behind a little bit too much. And going for range and HE is going to be great on Tarantula. Absolutely it is. It'll crush the ground, for sure. But there is now a level 2 Raiden on the other side. And the Void Eyes cannot deal with that because they do not have the aerial ability. So, even though the ground here gets completely crushed, the lack of anti-air is a little bit of a problem. We can move a little bit further along the way, where, you know, LichestKing gets into a little bit of trouble because of it. The Raiden is very high level, it has a spawn item, and it just becomes really, really tough to kill. Now, I will say LichestKing goes for the absolute correct play here by building an Overlord. We talked about it before, but it generally beats all of the other air units. Perhaps, you know, not talking about Abyss, but even Abyss it can beat. It's just a very powerful carry unit. And, well, it takes a little bit of time to get going. So, you know, we go from 2.5k hit points to 1.6 because Overlords need time to get going. And level advantages matter, right? Even if Raiden is not necessarily favored into Overlord, if it has 3 levels instead of 1, it's going to get the job done. And, yeah, that kind of is the whole story of this game, right? Early on, the players get in trouble because they either do not adequately defend their units, because they do not adequately tech their units, and, you know, they don't cover all of the bases, right? Make sure that you have enough chaff, and make sure that it actually is in a spot that it can protect your units, right? If your opponent is very close to you, you're going to need to put some chaff in front of your units because it's not going to have the time to overtake. Of course, you want some behind as well to create these multiple waves, and that is what goes really well in, you know, this intermediary level of 1500 MMR, and this board looks extremely solid, but the tiny mistakes that happen are just that extra efficiency you need to keep pushing even further if that is something that you want, right? So make sure to grab that Phoenix when it gets offered to you, or build it. It's just a very common flowchart play. Make sure that you covered, you know, not just your chaff clear, your DPS, but if you can, your DPS anti-air, which in this case is going to be offered to you. Now, that is pretty much how this game goes. It ends up with the carry boats absolutely taking over. The player here asked, oh, like, why was that the case? But really simple answer is just that Overlords are an absolutely, like, insane carry unit. They pretty much beat any board once you get them fully fleshed out. The only problem is that you typically do need a lot of them, right? About 5 or 6 even, with double tech. It is a giant. It is a 500 cost giant. So it takes a while to set up. And it also needs good chaff gear typically. So, you know, double tech Tarantula, double tech Overlord, it takes a while to get going. Which is why perhaps here, you know, it looked like the mid game was a bit slow. But anyway, I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it wasn't too all over the place. Do let me know if that was the case, or if you would want a different format where I only cover one replay. But I thought it would showcase, you know, this theme of using proper chaff and just defending your units, putting them in the correct spot, as well as buying the correct tech. Just think about that range in the early game and don't go over committing, and showcase it across, you know, different levels of gameplay, because it is something that applies no matter where you are on the ladder. Anyway, if you liked the video, please leave a thumbs up. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. If you want to stay up to date with all my latest content, please consider subscribing. And if you want to see me play live, check me out on Twitch. With that being said, take care, guys, and see you in the next video. Bye-bye.